Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
It's 30.
Welcome to the home of NYU Abu Dhabi here in New York. My name is Hilary Ballin. I am the Deputy Vice Chancellor of NYU Abu Dhabi. And one very important part of what I do is to help foster the connection between NYU in New York and NYU in Abu Dhabi. And one way we do that is through a set of public programs that reinforce the curricular program of NYU Abu Dhabi, that reinforce the values and bring individuals from NYU Abu Dhabi, from the Middle East, broadly speaking, to New York to exchange ideas. Tonight we have the first in a series that we're doing this year called The Demands of Tolerance. In our inaugural year last year, we did a series on cosmopolitanism because it was a word that was so frequently invoked as we were conceptualizing our project and identifying what kind of students and what kind of faculty we wanted and what the character of the curriculum would be. But it was a word so often misused or used so superficially, it seemed important to be more self-conscious about what was at stake in that idea. And so in what I think was a really interesting and impressive year-long series, we studied that, we investigated that idea, and very shortly we'll be bringing out a publication that gathers those presentations. And so this year we wanted to take another value, another idea that was important to the development of NYU Abu Dhabi, and I dare say to any academic community, namely tolerance, and to think about what is at stake in that idea and some of the challenges it presents. And of course, living in New York now and being as troubled as I'm sure everyone in this room is by the debate about the Islamic Center downtown and the wave of anti-Muslim, anti-mosque, anti-Islamic events across the country, and the calls for greater tolerance from some outspoken individuals like Mayor Bloomberg makes us all aware now of the demands of tolerance and how difficult it is in many circumstances to honor what that concept means. Tonight's program is going to be followed by a number of events throughout the year, one of which is actually organized by Professor Don Garrett, who I want to acknowledge because he's sitting right here. And he has organized a really fascinating program for us in the spring that is going to take us back to really a pivotal moment in the thinking about tolerance. We'll do an evening focused on Locke's ideas about tolerance. So please come to that in the spring. It's already posted on our website. But the very next event in our series is coming up in just a couple of weeks. It's on October 20th. And we are going to have Naif Al-Mutawa, who is the Kuwaiti founder and visionary behind this now world-famous sensation, the 99, come here and speak. The exhibit on the walls are just some of the images that were gathered by our curator, Carrie Barrett, who's standing by that door, to give you a sense of the main narrative structure of the 99, which is about Islamic superheroes from around the world who gather together to fight evil and intolerance. And it's the first comic book that features Islamic superheroes. So the exhibition is a reinforcement of this series theme, and we're really pleased that Naif Al-Mutawa will be here with us on October 20th, along with some of the cartoonists who did the drawing. So it promises to be a very interesting evening. Tonight's program, which will be properly introduced to you by Linder Gordon, our moderator, we will now proceed, and I would simply like to introduce Linda to you. Linda is one of the most accomplished historians of American culture and history in the world. She has written numerous books, but is one of the rare individuals, perhaps the only one, she'll know better than me, who's won the Bancroft Prize for the most outstanding work in American history for 2 separate publications. The first was The Great Arizona Orphan Abduction, in which you see her remarkable narrative gifts, the way that she integrates telling stories that grip you as a reader, with infusing those stories with so much rich historical content, is one of the most remarkable features of the book, no matter what field you study. To see how a historian can be a spellbinding story maker, that book exemplifies. And the second is her most recently published book on Dorothea Lange, which, in addition to winning the Bancroft Prize, has also been noted by the Los Angeles Times and other literary organizations that award prizes for her great literary gifts. I'm also really thrilled that Linda is going to be teaching in Abu Dhabi next year. We have a program which enables NYU faculty to come to Abu Dhabi and teach courses for a half semester, or semester, year, or even longer. Our goal is to have the faculties in both of these universities know one another, look at one another as colleagues, and so having NYU faculty go to Abu Dhabi is a critical part of building that kind of connectivity. So, Linda, for your participation in this project and for chairing tonight's program, I thank you so very much.
Thank you. Yes. Didn't anticipate that. I'm just going to do this from here because I'm going to be very brief. Can you hear me in the back? I'm just so pleased to see so many people here, and extremely pleased to be asked to introduce this discussion between 2 extraordinary intellectuals. I'm going to introduce both of them briefly, then you're going to hear separately from both of them. Then I will probably pose to them a few questions, and they will talk back and forth for a little while, and then it will be open to the floor, I hope with ample time for you to participate. These are both outstanding scholars of considerable breadth as well as depth in the issues about which they're concerned, and both of them have taken on some of the major and controversial issues of our time. Professor Saba Mahmood earned her PhD at Stanford and teaches anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. Before turning toward anthropology, interestingly enough, she earned a degree in architecture and in urban planning, and worked as an architect and as a developer of low-cost housing in Seattle. I suspect that this experience was by no means irrelevant to her concerns with the limitations of normative liberal notions of freedom and of what constitutes politics. The issues about which I believe she'll be talking today are come primarily from her book entitled The Politics of Piety, the Islamic Revival and the Feminist Subject, which was published in 2005. And it received the Victoria Shuck Award from the American Association of Political Science. More recently, she is the co-author of Is Critique Secular? Blasphemy, Injury, and Free Speech. She's the recipient of Carnegie Corporation's Islamic Scholar Award. And she's currently working on a book project entitled The Politics of Religious Freedom, Geopolitics, Sexuality, and the Minority Question, which focuses on the Middle East and Europe. Her broader fields center around issues of secularism, religion, gender, post-coloniality, and Islam. Professor Joan Scott, I suspect, is very well known to this audience, so I'm able to be somewhat briefer in her case. She holds a doctorate from the University of Wisconsin. She then went on to teach at a number of different universities and became a permanent member of the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies in 1985. She's probably best known to many people here as a leading feminist theorist with tremendous international influence. She should also be known as a leading civil libertarian who has spoken out about very important issues in the United States. In 2007, she published The Politics of the Veil, a critique of France's policy of banning hijab in the public schools. And through her origins as a French history scholar, she came to think very, very deeply about the issues of Muslim immigrants in a predominantly non-Muslim nation. So we're going to start with Professor Mahmood.
Thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure to be here with Joan, and we've been in conversation about some of these themes, so let's see how it unfolds when the discussion begins. Despite the proliferation of scholarship and writing on the topic of secularism over the last decade, as Joan Scott has pointed out recently, there is a striking lacuna in the scholarship about the central role sexuality regularly plays in contestations about the secular. This lacuna is all the more remarkable given the fact that most of the flashpoints over the secular in the world today are about sex and secularity. Battles over abortion, gay marriage, the regulation of the veil, ordination of gay priests, administration of HIV/AIDS programs, and international family planning programs, to mention only a few. Scott offers both a diagnosis of this analytical failure and ways of thinking about the nexus between sex and secularity. In her book, Politics of the Veil, she argues against the conventional narrative that portrays the unfolding of modern secularism as a triumphalist march of progress that liberated sexuality in its wake from taboos and controls of traditional religion. In the process, leveling sexual differences by granting women civil, political, and economic rights. Scott complicates both these claims by showing that not only has gender equality persisted in secular societies across Western and non-Western divide, but also, importantly, sexual difference continues to play a, if not the, constitutive role in organizing the proper boundary between the religious and the secular. In her forthcoming book, The Fantasy of Feminist History, Scott further argues that under secularism, and I quote here, sexual difference becomes the basis for representing alternatives between past and future, religion and rationality, private and public. She reads these representations in a psychoanalytic register, in part arguing that they simultaneously assuage deeply rooted unconscious anxieties about sexual difference and secure the plausibility of the secular. To the extent that these representations structure the meaning of secularism, she concludes, they feed into its normative expectations. Indeed, they contribute to the production of gendered secular subjects. In this paper tonight, I want to think about how the secular reorganization of religious life in post-colonial Muslim societies forces us to reconceptualize the relationship between sexuality, gender, and secularism in the context of Scott's observations. As I will argue, the case of post-colonial Muslim societies in the Middle East elucidates distinct dimensions of secular power that are not legible in the story about secularism in Western liberal societies. This includes, one, wow.
Somebody's leaning against the light switch.
Is that right? Actually, if they could be dimmed a little bit, you might be able to see the images better. Thank you. This includes, one, a historically distinct model of organizing religious difference that tweaks the secular regulation of sexuality and gender in unexpected ways. And two, this historical model has produced unique configurations of religious liberty and sexual politics in which Western power and geopolitics play a constitutive role. So let me start. One of the most common ways that the secularization of Muslim societies is narrated is by telling a story about the transformation of religious law, the Sharia, in the modern period. We are often told that the Sharia, which encompassed all spheres of life in the pre-modern period, came to be limited in scope through its sequestration to matters pertaining to family law and issues of marriage, inheritance, divorce, and child custody, what today is called personal status law or family law in many Muslim societies. This circumscription of the Sharia is supposed to stand in for the general curtailment of religious authority in the modern period, as societies came to be increasingly organized into distinctively differentiated spheres ruled by secular rationalities of civil law. It is further argued that when colonial powers came to the Middle East, they refrained from interfering in the religious affairs of colonized peoples, and therefore left family law intact as the space par excellence of the native culture's autonomy and freedom. This is a narrative that's also repeated in the context of India. As a result of this colonial ambivalence, the argument goes, the Sharia has taken on an ossified and recalcitrant quality that has remained untouched by the secularizing and liberalizing force of civil law. The preservation of the Sharia in the form of family law in this narrative is diagnosed as the symptom of a compromised secularism that prevails in Muslim societies. This account is flawed for a number of reasons. To begin with, the telescoping of the Sharia into family law did not simply curtail the scope of religious law, but also transformed it from a system of decentralized and locally administered set of norms and procedures to a codified system of rules and regulations administered by the centralized state. Family law, under the auspices of the modern state, has become not simply a tool for the execution of divine law, but is one of the techniques of modern governance and sexual regulation. The family becomes a privileged instrument and element in the regulation of the population under the auspices of the modern state. This is in part the story that Foucault narrates in The History of Sexuality. Neither the practice of personal status law nor the object to which it is applied, that is the family, has remained historically unchanged. One effect of this process is the historical transformation wrought in the concept of the family from a loose network of kin relations to a nuclear family, with its attendant notions of conjugality, companionate marriage, and bourgeois love. Secondly, the telescoping of the Sharia into family law did not simply curtail the scope of religious authority, but crucially helped secure a foundational distinction internal to political secularism, namely the distinction between the public and the private. Thus, the colonial powers' enshrinement of the Sharia as family law was not so much an expression of their benign tolerance for the native culture, rather it was a product of the secular formula for privatizing religion. And importantly, just as religion came to be privatized in the modern secular imaginary, so were matters pertaining to the family, sexuality, and gender difference. The privatization of these aspects of social life did not mean, of course, that they fell outside the purview of the state. Rather, they came to be increasingly regulated by the centralized state and its various political rationalities, no longer administered by local muftis, qadis, customary norms, and parochial moral knowledges. One paradoxical consequence of the secularization of Muslim societies is that just as religious authority becomes marginal to the conduct of civic and political affairs, it simultaneously comes to acquire a privileged place in the regulation of family and sexual relations. To put it another way, one of the results of the simultaneous privatization of religion and sexuality in the Muslim world is that the two have come to be ineluctably conjoined, such that questions of religious identity for the Muslim majority and non-Muslim minorities alike often entail contestations about gender, marriage, and the family. While some aspects of the story about the privatization of religion and family are shared across the Western and non-Western divide, what is distinct about post-colonial societies is that in most cases, family law continues to be administered solely in accord with religious guidelines, with no recourse to civil law. In other words, where family law or personal status law prevails, it remains the only source of adjudicating conflicts pertaining to marriage, divorce, and inheritance. This is just as true for Muslim family law as it is true for Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, or Jewish family laws in countries as varied as India, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Malaysia, Morocco, Syria, and Israel. In Lebanon alone, there are 15 different kinds of personal status laws. that pertain to different religious confessions, such as the Greek and Syriac Orthodox, the Armenian Apostolic Church, Maronite Christian Church, Sunni Islam, Shia Islam, to name only a few. One explosive consequence of this conjoining of intercommunal and family regulation is that political conflicts over religious difference often unfolds on the terrain of sexual and gender difference. Any attempt by the state to create a uniform civil code for adjudicating family relations is opposed by various religious groups, particularly religious minorities, as an incursion into the autonomy of these religious communities. The famous Saba case in India exemplifies these tensions. Let me give a short account of this case so as to give you a flavor of the explosive nature of such conflicts and the assumptions that undergird them. In 1985, the Supreme Court of India ruled that Shabano, a 62-year-old divorced Indian woman, was to be paid alimony by her ex-husband, a ruling that was contrary to Muslim family law but in accord with the Criminal Procedure Code of India. The Muslim minority of India protested this ruling as an unfair incursion by the state into affairs over which they had legal autonomy. Faced with Muslim protests in 1986, the Indian government reversed the Supreme Court decision and passed a bill that removed Muslim women from the requirements of the Criminal Procedure Code. This bill in turn provoked a vitriolic reaction from secular leftist and women's rights groups, as well as the Hindu right-wing political parties, all of whom argued that the bill weakened the secular basis of Indian citizenship by giving way to the orthodox and patriarchal forces of a minority religion. I should just briefly point out that this is not text that is I'm not authoring these texts, I'm just lifting some of this text from the newspapers that I was reading for this case. Since then, the debate about the adoption of a uniform family law in India has come to be represented as a contest between those who champion the individual rights of Muslim women, represented as victims of unjust gender practices of a Muslim community, and the collective rights of the Muslim minority, painted as backward and patriarchal. In this framing, secularism emerges as the guarantor of gender equality and civil rights, while religion is made to stand in for gender injustice, communalism, and obscurantism. Needless to say, this way of framing the issue leaves no possibility of thinking about the symbiotic relationship between the religious and the secular in creating this conflict. The Shabano case is one among many such cases that exemplify the turn political conflicts over religious difference take in post-colonial societies. A very similar debate, however, recently unfolded in England, when the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, suggested that not unlike Jewish customary law practiced in UK, Muslims might also be allowed to use Islamic family law to settle conflicts of marriage and divorce. There was a bitter backlash by many in Britain who saw this proposal as a threat to British secularism that would also open the door to institutionalizing the backward and patriarchal laws of a religious minority. A very similar conflict and confrontation erupted between the Muslim minority and non-Muslim majority in Canada in 2005. What is common to all these controversies is that the demand for and opposition to family law is ultimately cast as a conflict between the secular liberal principle of individual equality and that of religious pluralism. This way of framing the issue is key to the classical debate within liberal political theory about how to draw the proper boundary between the rights of minority groups against the larger society on the one hand, and the rights of each minority group against its own individual members on the other. The answer to this dilemma is far from clear and has been negotiated in a variety of ways. What is important to note, however, is that the question of gender equality sits at the center of this interminable conflict. It might be useful here to recall the multicultural debates in the 1980s in North America. The problem these debates articulated was never simply how to let multiple cultures bloom in a liberal polity, but to ensure the institutional conditions for the preservation and reproduction of minority traditions and ways of life. The classic case in this debate was that of the Native American communities. Notably, the issue of women's equality as an individual right secured against religious tradition, custom, and culture often served as a litmus test in this work to define the limits of the autonomy accorded to minority groups to practice their traditions. Something quite similar is no doubt at stake in the debates about family law that I have been citing here. In that, opposition to Sharia-based family law is often staged as an argument for establishing the rights of women as individuals against the tyranny of custom and religious tradition. But there is also something else at stake. It has to do with how the legal justification for upholding religion-based family laws has increasingly come to be grounded in the right to religious freedom, a grounding that further amplifies the tensions between an individualist and a group conception of rights. There are, for example, two distinct and contradictory notions of religious freedom that exist in international law and a variety of national constitutions. One that casts freedom, the right to religious liberty, one that casts the right to religious liberty as an individual right, as in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And a second one that casts it in communal terms as the right of a minority group to profess and practice its religion and culture without undue restraint from the state or majoritarian culture. In so much as the conflict between these competing claims to religious freedom are settled by the sovereign prerogative of the modern state, then the right to religious liberty is one of the key sites where the boundary between the religious and the secular is now often negotiated and set. It is often asked as to why have issues of sexual regulation come to be tethered to religious identity in post-colonial societies in such a pernicious and insidious manner. The quick and easy answer has often been that this process is indexical of the incomplete character of non-Western secularism, aided and abetted by the colonial power's anxiety about interfering in native religious life. The assumption is that if these societies had gone through a complete process of secularization, if colonial powers had done their duty, then the religious basis of family law would surely have been abolished, taking down with it the patriarchal norms of kinship grounded in religious doctrines. Apart from the fact that such an answer rehearses the exhausted trope of non-Western modernity and secularism as always a lack or inadequacy, what is far more important is its failure to recognize the fact that what we call family law or personal status law today is a fragment of a historical model in which religious difference was conceptualized and organized very differently than the system of post-colonial nation states in which it is now inserted. This historical fragment has come to acquire a particularly pernicious form under secularism's foundational divide between the public and the private. As such, it is neither an expression of the essential religiosity of these societies nor a diagnosis of the incomplete secularism. It is another mutation of the Janus-faced character of modern secularism in which religion is ineluctably tied to its Siamese twin, the secular, an intertwining that is often disavowed by those who speak in its name from both sides. Consider, for example, the historical continuities and disruptions that the institutionalization of family law manifests in modern Egypt. Egypt's current family laws, both Muslim and Christian, are a legacy from the Ottoman period when religious difference was the primary axis for the organization of a unique socio-political order. For those of you who might not know, the Ottoman Empire was an Islamic empire that lasted for over 6 centuries, from 13th to the 20th century, and at the height of its power, extended over a vast geographical expanse from the Middle East, North Africa, Eastern Europe, and West Asia, ruling over an immense diversity of religious faiths. What was remarkable about the Ottoman Empire was its system of organizing religious difference, in which each community had juridical autonomy over religious and family affairs, as well as a range of other domains. The non-liberal model of pluralism was quite distinct from the liberal model in that each religious community's autonomy was justified, not in terms of group versus individual rights, but a political order in which difference was paramount. The Ottomans did not aim to politically transform difference into sameness. Instead, various contiguous religious groups were integrated through a vertical system of hierarchy in which Muslims occupied the highest position. A number of historians have argued that unlike the European Christian empires of the 16th and 17th centuries that sought to suppress or eradicate religious difference, thereby provoking almost 100 years of religious wars in Europe, the stability of the Ottoman Empire in part derived from a system in which religious difference was assigned a recognized place in the socio-political order, an order that was nonetheless ineluctably hierarchical. While many aspects of this older system were slowly transformed over the course of the 19th century, the judicial and legislative autonomy of most religious communities continued to be maintained. This state of affairs, however, was transformed in the colonial period when the distinction between the public and the private came to be instituted, with religious and family affairs located in the former. The part of the Ottoman system that the British Empire preserved, under a radically different logic of secular governance, was the religious basis of family law in Egypt. This system has continued to prevail in post-colonial Egypt, even as the principle of civil and political equality aims to level religious differences within the national citizenry. Let me elucidate the complex and volatile character of this secular dispensation by considering the case of Coptic Christians in Egypt, the largest Christian minority in the Middle East. While the Coptic Orthodox Church is granted autonomy to adjudicate Coptic family affairs, this autonomy also stands in tension with the sovereign state's prerogative to regulate civil, political, and religious affairs on the one hand, and the assimilative thrust of the national culture that remains Islamic in its ethos and substance on the other. The Coptic Orthodox Church realizes that their members are always under subtle social pressure to convert to Islam and to assimilate to Muslim ways of life. This is not because Copts are subject to Muslim proselytization, but because of unfair regulations and norms that favor religious conversion from Christianity to Islam, while making the reverse far more difficult. While there are no clear laws that prohibit interreligious conversion, in practice, the Egyptian state makes it extremely hard for Muslim converts to obtain legal recognition and documents necessary for the conduct of civil and political life. Given these conditions, it is not surprising that the Coptic community is rife with rumors and anxieties about how Muslims are always trying to snare Christians to convert. Such anxieties are particularly manifest when Coptic women and girls either marry or have romantic liaisons with Muslim men. Copts widely believe that there is a conspiracy on the part of Muslims to abduct and coerce Coptic girls to convert to Islam. Despite the disputed and contested nature of this claim, news of Coptic girls' forced conversion to Islam circulates widely in the national and diasporic Coptic media. While rumors about Coptic women's abduction had circulated in the past, what is new about this turn is that women's conversion has become the flashpoint for arguments about the religious freedom of the community as such. One of the most incendiary incidents to erupt on the Egyptian scene, which captures the conjuncture between family law, minority identity, and sexual difference, occurred in November of 2004, when a 47-year-old woman by the name of Wafa Constantine, who was married to a Coptic priest, went missing in a small village. Upon investigation, the security police reported that she had converted to Islam and was now living with a Muslim family in Cairo. Immediately following the news, protests broke out in the village of her residence, and Coptic demonstrators accused the security police of failing to bring Constantine back to her home after they had discovered her whereabouts. Stories circulated that she had fallen in love with her Muslim colleague who had convinced her to elope and to convert. Thousands of Copts occupied the Coptic Patriarchate in Cairo, shouting slogans such as "Religious conversion cannot be coerced" and "Stop the gangs of women kidnappers." When the police failed to turn her in, the Coptic Pope used his personal influence with the president to demand Constantine's return. On the night of December 8th, after huge demonstrations, the security police handed over Constantine to the church, at which point, under tight state security, she was taken into custody by the church officials and sequestered from public. The church emphatically denied Constantine's conversion to Islam and charged that under the use of force and drugs, she had lapsed momentarily, but was otherwise holding firm in her faith. Since she was handed over to the church at the end of 2004, Constantine has not been seen or heard from again. In 2008, when several Muslim clerics charged in an incendiary fashion that the church had killed Constantine, church officials announced that she was alive and living in a secluded life in the Pope's home monastery, and will soon appear on Coptic television. To date, no such sightings have been reported. Now, notably, in the public debate that followed Constantine's alleged conversion and subsequent sequestration, there was little discussion about Constantine's motivations. We still know very little about who she is, why she left her home, and indeed whether or not she converted to Islam, and if so, under what circumstances. Instead, public debate focused on the classic conflict between her individual right to religious liberty and the Coptic community's right to persevere against perceived Muslim aggression, as well as their right to defend the community's honor, whose ultimate repository, after all, are deemed to be its women. Among the few who expressed a concern for Constantine's motivations and well-being was Tariq al-Bishri, a leading Islamic reformer, a well-respected jurist, and a critic of the government. Bishri is well known for having written one of the earliest books on the rights of religious minorities in Egypt within the framework of the Sharia. Bishri excoriated the Coptic Church for its hypocrisy in demanding the right to religious freedom for Copts as a minority on the one hand, and violating Constantine's individual right to convert to Islam on the other. He wrote, and I quote, "The church administration violated its own oft-repeated call to uphold freedom of religion and the right to interreligious conversion, regardless whether it is to or from Islam," end of quote. Now, while Bishri is right to point out the hypocrisy of the church, he fails to recognize that this contradiction between minority group rights and individual rights is a structural feature of the discourse on religious liberty, especially when invoked in relationship to religious minorities. In so much as this tension remains unresolved within the discourse on religious liberty, liberal discourse on religious liberty, then its resolution ultimately devolves upon the particular accord established between religious minorities and the state. In the case of post-colonial Egypt, this accord has entailed granting autonomy to the Coptic Church over its family affairs, while at the same time limiting the possibility of conversion to Christianity. Even though Coptic family law does not prohibit conversion to Islam or any other religion, such an act nonetheless touches upon the vulnerabilities of the life of a community already under the threat of assimilation or discrimination. It is within this context that the American evangelical movement, surprisingly, has stepped into the fray. New twist in the story, exacerbating and transforming the conflict in uniquely new ways. This is a longer paper and I'm skipping, but bear with me. Last year, how am I doing for time?
Fine, just fine.
Okay. Last year, the plot just gets thicker. Christian Solidarity International, an evangelical organization that works on behalf of what is now called the Global Persecuted Church, released a report that gives the issue an unprecedented prominence in the global and international arena. This report not only seeks to document the abduction of Coptic girls by Muslim men, but also elevates the charge to the category of sexual slavery that is now part of a UNESCO campaign and regarded as a crime by the US State Department under its new legislation on human trafficking. This evangelical mobilization has been very effective in recent years with the passage of two landmark pieces of legislation in the United States. First is the International Religious Freedom Act, passed under President Clinton in 1998, which mandates the US State Department and the President of the United States to persecute violators of religious freedom globally, with a particular focus on the treatment of Christian minorities living in the Middle East. The second piece of legislation, known as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, also passed in 2009, established the US State Department's Office to Combat Human Trafficking on a global scale. As the work of Elizabeth Bernstein has shown, the spate of US anti-trafficking laws that have emerged in the wake of this act creates several criminal penalties for pimps and sexual clients who are portrayed as slaveholders. And it imposes financial sanctions upon nations deemed to be taking insufficient steps to stem prostitution, understood to be self-identical with human trafficking and with slavery. The campaign against sexual slavery won another victory in 2000 when the United Nations passed a new protocol to prevent human trafficking in women and children, particularly under Article 3 of this protocol. It is under the umbrella of these two projects of religious freedom and sexual slavery that the Christian Solidarity International released its widely circulated report, giving evidentiary credence to the claim that Coptic girls and women are abducted, sexually abused, forced to convert to Islam, and marry Muslim men. While the evidence given by this report is uneven, it argues that the process of luring a woman into a relationship for the purpose of forced marriage, and I'm quoting here, when accompanied by force, fraud, or coercion, therefore constitutes an act of human trafficking, end of quote. As such, the report calls upon the United States government to act in accord with the U.S. Trafficking Women's Protection Act to pressurize the Egyptian government to change its policy toward conversions. This appeal is now repeated widely by Christian television and broadcasting networks and other evangelical media outlets in the US and Europe. The portrayal of Coptic women converts as coerced subjects of conversion is crucial to this story. This claim largely turns on the vulnerability of Coptic women to what is characterized as the predatory practices of Muslim men, rooted in the Islamic traditions that legitimize violence against women and non-Muslims. This is a quote from the letter that accompanies this report. The report plays on the post-9/11 sentiments of its American audience, drawing upon widely available tropes of Muslim male violence, Islam's inherent misogyny, and its lack of tolerance. In so much as the Coptic women converts are portrayed as agentless actors preyed upon by Muslim men, what is erased from this picture is the role of the Coptic Orthodox Church in policing and punishing the conversion of its members, as exemplified by the case of Afafa Constantine. In this framing, what is striking is that a Coptic woman's submission to the Coptic community and its institutions emerges as the paradigmatic act that secures the community's collective exercise of religious liberty. In such a context, a Coptic woman's conversion to Islam cannot be rendered in terms of her religious liberty precisely because she has become the bearer of the community's religious freedom. This paradoxical conjoining of her submission and the collectivity's freedom is not an expression of an essential religio-cultural patriarchy, as some feminists have tended to argue. Rather, it is a product of the secular dispensation in which minority identity has come to be vested in the regulation of the family, whose exemplary bearer is, after all, its women. Note that minority and majority operate here not simply as legal, but also gendered categories in so much as they mirror the hierarchical relationship between the coerced Coptic woman and the aggressive Muslim male. In conclusion, I would like to make 2 points that summarize my argument. First, while the Coptic problem is indeed particular to Muslim societies, it is also important to realize that a constellation of global forces have played a constitutive role in transforming the terrain on which the Coptic question can be imagined, argued, and debated, key among them the power of American evangelical Christianity to define a new set of geopolitical agendas in our present. It would be difficult to imagine this global force as religious in any simple sense, distinct from the operation of secular power, given how deeply imbricated the US State Department and various United Nations agencies are in the campaigns that evangelicals have helped mobilize. As such, the Coptic Muslim struggle cannot be understood simply in culturalist or Islamic terms. Rather, it provokes us to reflect on the consistencies and idiosyncrasies that the past and present of post-colonial societies represent in the making of the secular at a global and geopolitical scale. Second and last point, one would expect that the introduction of the discourse on religious liberty, especially in its individualist formulation, would break the circumspection of religion, family, and sexuality, that its critical power would pry loose the rigid hold of this circumscription, providing a reprieve from this hothouse of mutual constitutions. But as my analysis has shown here, the discourse on the right to religious liberty, counterintuitively, has only deepened this circumscription, further investing the minority and majority identities in this logic. the fact that this fixing has been in part achieved through supranational forces of legislation and power only reminds us that such matters are not simply cultural, but also geopolitically determined. Thank you.
Saba, that was wonderful. That was a really terrific talk. My talk is somewhat more general, and in a way, I think you can think of it as an alternative to the title of this series of talks on tolerance. I tend to agree with the political theorist Wendy Brown that tolerance is often a way of thinking about how one regulates aversion. That is, how one deals with these different groups who are somehow lesser than we are, but whom one has to tolerate, put up with, in order to establish a certain kind of harmony or social peace or social order. So I think that thinking about the question of difference and addressing and dealing with the question of difference is another way, or maybe a better way, than thinking in terms of good models of tolerance. And this paper is called Feminism's Difference Problem. Feminism is at once a product and a critique of modernity. Its Western European origins, and that's what I'm talking about is Western feminism, lie in Enlightenment emancipatory projects, which even as they proclaim the equality of all mankind, establish the distinctions between civilized and savage, rational and superstitious, male and female, historical and traditional, that underpin structures of class, gender, and race, and enabled imperial adventures and colonial domination. As a movement for women's emancipation, whether specified as full access to education, employment, citizenship, or law, feminism has had to contend with its double heritage. Universality conceived in opposition to particularity, sameness achieved by overcoming, abstracting, suppressing, or dismissing difference. The irony is that even as they challenge the false universal of man, exposing it as a patriarchal ruse, feminists in the West invoke the universal category of woman or women to rally support for their cause. Although the cause was political, hence mutable and historically specific, education, the vote, abortion rights, and so on, women was portrayed as a timeless and homogeneous category. Whether the commonality of women was posited as biological, maternity, mothers of the race, the social value of reproductive labor, sex, the inborn traits of femininity, nurturing, caring, concerning for the group or community, and so on, or as a shared experience of social, economic, political, or psychological subordination to, in one form or another, the law of the father, it was presumed to traverse differences even as it took them into account. But inclusion in the general category of woman or women depended nevertheless on the exclusion of those who were too different to fit. Just as universal man embodied the particularities of white middle-class men, so universal woman was most often represented as white, middle-class, and heterosexual. The great struggles of feminism, and not only in its most recent second wave since the 1960s, have had to do with challenges from those excluded by the universal claim. So in the United States, the black slave Sojourner Truth asks a convention of white suffragists in 1848, and aren't I a woman too? And more than a century later, the Combahee River Collective denounces racism in the white women's movement. So the question of class divides 19th century socialists and feminists as it does pro-abortion activists in the United States in the 20th century, some of whom miss the class and racial implications of the Hyde Amendment as they focus on the larger issue of abortion rights. So lesbians protest the heterosexual presumptions of what counts as feminism, indirectly in the 19th century, powerfully at the end of the 20th. So at successive UN conferences from Mexico City to Beijing and after, the fictional unity of women is given the lie by the factionalism of geopolitics, North versus South, West versus East, Israel versus Palestine. And so after the fall of communism, Eastern European feminists charge their Western counterparts with condescension and misrepresentation. As Elizabeth Spellman put it, the paradox at the heart of feminism is how to weigh the things women have in common with the differences among us. Or, as Olympe de Gouges commented wryly 2 centuries earlier, feminists, quote, have only paradoxes to offer and no problems easy to resolve, end of quote. The last decade of the 20th century saw an outpouring of attempts to address the paradox. Invocations of the mantras of race, class, gender, and sexuality, reminders of the need to historicize not only various feminisms, but the very category of women, and so its contingent meanings and political uses. The continued search for commonality on the part of some people. The book, Robin Morgan's Sisterhood is Global, has an appendix that lists the word for sister in every country in the world. The pluralizing of women, the insistence on their differences, arguments about the irrelevance of these differences in the face of the universality of the masculine-feminine binary, hence parité advocates in France, Françoise Gaspard, Claude Servan-Schreiber, and Anne Le Gall, quote, "Women are everywhere. They are in all classes, in all social categories. They are Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, agnostic. Women are neither a group nor a lobby. They constitute half of the sovereign people, half of the human species," end of quote. Or another French feminist, Blandine Kriegel, quote, "Femininity is a universal, and just as one is human when one is masculine, so when one is feminine, one is human." There were also theories of intersectionality, multiple identity, subject formation, standpoint epistemology, turns away from foundationalism and metaphysics and to structural linguistics and psychoanalysis. The richness of the efforts is a measure not of the limits of our thinking, but of the difficulty, even the intractability of the paradox. If the relentless puzzle of sameness and difference, the universal and the particular, is one aspect of the conceptualization of modernity, so is the opposition between the secular and the religious, which has lately become a more central and explosive ingredient in feminist conversations. If first wave feminism had its religiously inspired activists, English Quakers in the 18th century, Protestant anti-slavery activists in England and the US in the 19th, second wave feminism has been decidedly more secular. Religion is often dismissed as an instrument of patriarchy that provides the ideological justification for women's subordination as God's will. The association of religion with tradition, superstition, dogma, orthodoxy, all that is against reason, democracy, and history, is one of the heritages of the Enlightenment that most feminists have not deconstructed. Indeed, the antagonism between religion and second wave feminism is so deeply ingrained as to have virtually eliminated it as a serious topic for theoretical consideration. This is not to say that there aren't feminists in the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim traditions who take as their mission the formulation of less sexist theological interpretations of biblical texts, or that there aren't feminist scholars in religious studies who have addressed these questions. There are, of course, long-standing and important efforts of this kind. It is to say that the opposition between modernity and religion hasn't received the same far-reaching feminist critical scrutiny that has been given to other features of modernity, such as universalism. The reasons for this are part of modernity's history. They surely have to do with the way, in the process of secularization, women and religion were both placed on the negative side of the opposition between past and future. Women were depicted by philosophy, political theory, medicine, and literature as the sex, passionate, credulous, incapable of rational thought, bodies not minds, superstitious, pawns of the clergy, representatives of the private, immune to secular temporalities outside of history. Organized religion, for its part, gave substance to its reputation as an enemy of progress and emancipation, often insisting that its tenets were immutable, even as they changed, and that norms of gender hierarchy were divinely sanctioned. Thus, it makes some sense that in the Australian feminist Bronwyn Winter's words, quote, "Organized religion in general and monotheistic religions in particular are not compatible with any feminist project," end of quote. If feminists were to claim equality, they had first to repudiate the association of women with religion before even disputing the religious justifications for their subordination. In so doing, they would place themselves on the modern side of the opposition between future and past, change and tradition, reason and superstition, the secular and the sacred. Religion as such was to be refuted and repudiated. It was not a subject for a more probing critical inquiry. But in the last few decades, the emergence of Islam as a geopolitical phenomenon has caused confusion and anxiety for many feminists. In the clash of civilizations controversy, feminists have found their intuitive antipathy to religion an inadequate guide for action. If religion were the enemy, the locus of women's subordination, did the distinctions between benign practitioners of the faith and fundamentalist terrorists really matter? What position should be taken in face of something like the Bush administration's argument that the war in Afghanistan was undertaken to liberate women from the strictures of an absolutist religion? When in a move that could not be detached from its racist motivations, the French government banned the hijab in public schools, could feminists approve this action as emancipatory? That many did is a sign, I think, not of clear Republican thinking, but of the trap created for feminists by the religion versus modernity opposition. In this discourse, those who reject religion are said to be acting as agents. Those who accept it are by definition being subjected against their will. That's the reason, too, for the recent groundswell of feminist support in France for the banning of burqas in public space. And I don't know if you've been following this banning, but in the law that now is awaiting constitutional evaluation, the penalties are much more severe for men who supposedly force women to wear a burqa than they are for the women who wear them. The women who wear them are banned from public and fined something like 130 euros. The men who are said to force them to wear burqas are sentenced to at least a year in prison and fined something like 30,000 euros. So the whole weight of the interpretation is that it's men who are forcing women to do this. Women have no agency in their decision to wear this garment. How has the coercive state become, in the thinking of these feminists, and it has, the guarantor of women's liberation, and not only women's liberation, but women's sexual liberation? Why has it been so difficult to accept the idea that religious belief might motivate women's individual choices in ways unfamiliar to Western feminists? To understand that the construction of a self might involve the choice of submission to a communal order or to the will of a god? Why has it been almost impossible to think about agency in other than secular terms? And here, of course, these questions are inspired by Saba's book, Politics of Piety, in which she, in a very controversial or very provocative way, challenges the notion that of emancipation held almost intuitively by Western people, and particularly by Western feminists. To be sure, there's no unanimity among feminists on these issues, and there's also, not surprisingly, no clear line of thinking on the matter. Someone like Bronwyn Winter bemoans the marginalization in France of secular anti-racist feminists caught in the middle or pushed out of the debates, which she says were hijacked by other agendas. But she can offer no solution to the dilemma she describes. Indeed, she concludes that there is no simple alternative, quote, that refuses collusion with either church or state in their manipulation of women's agency or women's rights. Finding such a solution, I suggest, is a question not only of strategy, but of theory. It involves thinking with, but not within, the terms that structure the debate, not resolving the impasse they seem to create, but analyzing its operations and its effects. In this way, we productively loosen the grip of closed binary thinking. The categories become the object of critique, not the defining terms of our conversations. The deconstruction of the secular religious opposition involves, as Talal Asad argues, a genealogy of the secular, an examination of its articulation in the discourse of modernity. It's not surprising that those who have begun this work find that religion was the key oppositional element. Writes the sociologist of religion Tomoko Masuzawa, quote, "The modern discourse on religion and religions was from the beginning, that is to say, inherently, if also ironically, a discourse of secularization. At the same time, it was clearly a discourse of othering. My suspicion is that some deep symmetry and affinity obtain between these two wings of the religion discourse, that they conjointly enable this discourse to do the vital work of churning the stuff of Europe's ever-expanding epistemic domain and of forging from that ferment an enormous apparition, the essential identity of the West," end of quote. As self-consciously modern Europeans assume that religion was an aspect of a fast disappearing past, new fields of study expressed and elaborated this belief. And this is again a quote from Masuzawa. "Two new sciences pertaining to non-European worlds, anthropology and Orientalism, promoted and bolstered the presumption that this thing called religion still held sway over all those who were unlike them, non-Europeans, Europeans of the pre-modern past, and among their neighbors, the uncivilized and uneducated bucolic populace, as well as the superstitious urban poor, all of whom were something of savages within," end of quote. It's certainly the case that many European feminists shared this view of tradition-bound others at home and abroad. Mazuzawa describes a process in the course of the 19th century which involved the Hellenization, she calls it the Hellenization and the Aryanization of Christianity, in parallel with the Arabization of Islam, even though most Muslims were not then, as not now, Arabs. Quote, "The rule of Islam was now condescendingly viewed as narrow, rigid, and stunted, and its essential attributes were said to be defined by the national, racial, and ethnic character of the Arabs, the most bellicose and adversarial of the Semites," end of quote. The civilizing missions undertaken by European imperial powers were aimed at domesticating, if not eradicating, these peoples. The invocation of secularism today in Western feminist condemnations of Islam, sometimes carefully distinguishing its political from its pietistic forms, sometimes conflating it with terrorism and or the worst forms of patriarchal oppression, carries with it traces of these 19th century articulations. This despite adaptations and reformulations in different historical and geopolitical contexts, among them eloquent attempts by Muslim feminists such as Marie-Aimée Elie-Lucas to insist that fundamentalists do not speak for all of Islam and that all Muslims, an ethnic category that refers to people, category, states, laws, and customs, are not Islamic in the religious sense. Careful definitions are not enough to challenge these deeply rooted ideological formations, especially when they reinvoke the secular religious opposition. The question is, what will it take to mount such a challenge? My own answer is to take seriously Talal Assad's call for a genealogy of secularism, looking at the histories of secularization in the way that Saba has provided an example, I think, tonight. And here are areas that I would look at as a European historian. First, the history of secularization in the Christian West is tied to the emergence of the nation state and the separation of politics from religion. And at least in the cases I've looked at, whether they aim to place denominational struggles outside the realm of national and international politics, to deny political authority to ecclesiastical leaders, or to subordinate the power of churches to state control, the theorists of what we now call secularism address the relationship between the institutions of church and state with little reference to the relationships between women and men. And I happened to look a couple of years ago at a report that was put out in France by the Conseil d'État, which is the Council of State, which is the highest administrative court in France, and its whole job is to deal with the legality of the actions taken by public bodies. And I looked at the judgments relating to the law of 1905, the law on which separates church and state in France, the law that embodies what's called in France laïcité. From 1905, when the law is passed, until 1987, there are no rulings that have anything to do with gender equality. And when you read the law itself, in fact, it says nothing about women and men. I mean, it's all about whether the state should pay chaplains in prisons and hospitals, what a recognized religion is as opposed to a kind of cult. You know, Scientologists, for example, are not considered a religion in France, and so on and so on and so forth. But in 1987, the woman question comes up in relation to the European community's prohibition of sex discrimination. A group of Catholic nuns argues that they're not being treated in the same way as Catholic priests are, and the Conseil d'État rules that they have to be treated in an equal way. In 1989, when the law on the hijab, prohibiting the wearing of headscarves in public schools, is first introduced, the Conseil d'État rules that the law is not, or the prohibition is not legitimate because there is no threat to public order and no proselytizing in the schools. It says nothing about gender equality. Same when it rules again in 1993 or 1904. It's not until 2004, on the eve of the passage of the headscarf ban, that the report by the Conseil d'État notes that its previous decisions regarding Muslims and headscarves have been less influenced than they now have to be by, quote, questions linked to Islam and to the place and status of Muslim women in society. So that the question of women's equality as a feature of the separation of this law on church and state in France is a new one for this body that's been offering guidance for about a century on the meanings of the law of 1905. It comes up only in the context of heated debates about the place of so-called immigrants, North African immigrants in French society. So you see really clearly in a situation like that what the relationship between gender equality and secularism historically has been in that situation. There are other, so that would be one area, looking at the history of secularization as it happens in separate states. Another would be looking at imperialist adventures and the ways in which colonial powers often justify their conquests in terms that make the treatment of women an index of civilization. And here again, you can go I go to France because it's the country I know best, but well before women win the vote in France, the French are touting their treatment of women as far superior to the treatment of women in Algeria. At the height of the Algerian War for Independence, there's a sort of great ceremony held in which the Algerian women a group of them are brought together and liberated. That is, their veils are taken off. And this is a sign not of the oppressive nature of French rule, because the war for independence is going on at this moment, but of the liberating, civilizing mission that the French are accomplishing, and so on and so forth. You can look at post-colonial situations. Again, at the story of Algerian nationalists, many of them committed to modernity, coming into power at the end of the war for independence, at the moment of Algerian liberation, and grappling, as Frantz Fanon does, with what he says is, on the one hand, the tenacity of the occupier in his enterprise to unveil women, to make of them an ally in the work of cultural destruction. That has had the effect of strengthening traditional patterns of behavior and of our defense of them, even as Fanon is, to say the least, ambivalent about the question of whether these traditional patterns of behavior in the form, particularly in relation to women and headscarves, whether that is to go on, and so on. The question not only of imperialist domination or imperialist exporting of the terms of secularism, but the question of how modern notions of the secular are picked up in in non-Western places. Afsana Najmabadi's work on Iran shows this really clearly. She argues that influences from the West led in the 19th century, well before the reforms of the Shah, to anxiety about sex and particularly masculine sexuality. She writes, the modernist project of female emancipation centered on the desirability of heterosocialization, unveiling women and encouraging to socialize with men, and transforming marriage from a sexual to a romantic contract was premised on and productive of the disavowal of male homoeroticism. It was also pushed in order to eradicate same-sex practices among males. So there again, all of these streams or threads that one could pull and follow. Then there's finally the question for me of sexual difference, the sort of psychoanalytic approach that one could take to some of these questions, to ask what it is about sexual difference that becomes so intractable and so difficult in secular societies. I've been having a sort of ongoing running argument with Michael Warner, who writes about these things, about whether psychoanalysis is at all useful for thinking about these kinds of questions, the way in which the public-private distinction that Saba talked about in the case of family law and secular law, but the way in secular societies, the public-private distinction is tied to the separation of religious from the political. And the public-private distinction, which at the same moment that religion is considered a private matter of private conscience, privacy and the home and domestic life and family life are separated from the public. So what is it about the coincidence of the two things, the privatization of the domestic family and the privatization of religion, that coincide to say something about the status and position of women and to render them not equals but unequals in secular societies? I think that in some ways psychoanalysis can provide an answer, or psychoanalysis is what I think I said to Michael Warner in the last exchange we had, was that I think psychoanalysis can be thought of as a theory of sexual subject formation in modern Western societies, not as an eternal, universal, interpretive plan, but if you want to understand something of what sexuality and the secular are about, or what the connection is between them, turning to psychoanalysis is not a bad idea. But we can discuss that in the end. I just would say, or in the question period, if you're interested or want to, what I would say is that just to sort of briefly summarize it, is that if you posit sexual difference, the difference between women and men, as a source not of predictable behaviors, but as enormous psychic anxiety, you have a set of historical questions that you can ask about how that anxiety is expressed and addressed differently in different contexts and at different times. You would assume an interaction between changing social, economic, and political circumstances and psychic life. The causality wouldn't be unidirectional, and you would ask these questions. Are there unique ways in which secularism or secularisms address sexual difference? Does it matter if God or nature or culture is the foundation on which the explanation rests? And if so, how? Are there particular approaches to sexuality that can be called secular? Are they necessarily linked to gender equality in its substantive as well as its formal implementation? What have secularists meant by equality historically? How has this changed over time? And what has equality signified in relation to psychic anxieties about the meanings of sexual difference? Thinking about sexual difference in this way, I think, as an irritant to rational explanation, lets us take our distance from the story of secularism as an inherently and necessarily emancipatory experience for women. So it's not a repudiation of secularism that's wanted. I am not arguing that secularism is a bad thing, but critical thinking about it, especially as it has shaped a certain feminist outlook. A simple inversion of the secular religious opposition is not useful. The point is not to embrace the other's religion as a way of dissociating ourselves from Western colonial racism. We don't want to idealize either category, but to historicize them in relation to one another, to ask what kind of work the categories have done and are doing, and how the situation of women and the thinking of feminists have been implicated in this history. When French politicians ban headscarves or burqas in the name of women's equality and sexual freedom, we should ask what they mean by equality, how their rhetoric contributes to the fortification of that 19th century notion of modern European identity with its own normative conception of women's place, in the face of huge historical transformations now going on. How does an uncritical endorsement of that idea of equality associate feminists with defensive nationalist projects they might otherwise be skeptical of?
Joan, can you wind up?
I am. That's what I have these two more sentences, or three. How does the denunciation of religion, the particular religion of Islam as the source of oppression, veil not only secular oppressions, but the many varieties of religious experience? Can we think about a feminist critique of the secular that would be similar to the feminist critique of the universal, one that would ask not how to define it, but how it operates, one that would contest its exclusions even as it has aspired to some of its principles, one that would acknowledge that religion's history is inextricable from the history of modernity, that it is one of the excluded differences we must now address. How would feminist discourse be changed by that theorization? Is the difference problem, raised by treating religion as a modern phenomenon and not as modernity's antithesis, any less serious than the challenges posed by those once excluded others, women of color, third world women, and lesbians? How and in what ways? So these are the issues I think we now face. In the long history of feminism, difference has played a dynamic role in constituting feminist movements, both because it consolidated groups of women around specific political issues and because it exposed the exclusionary limits of how membership in those groups was defined. It's also been an unending problem defying simple pluralizing solutions. In the past few years, religion as identity, right of conscience, choice, subjection, and subjectivity has become a critical issue. It has engendered the same passion and engagement that characterized the debates of the closing decades of the 20th century. In so doing, it has opened political and theoretical challenges that awaken anxiety and expectation. Anxiety because the seemingly solid rock of the secular has developed cracks and fissures. Expectation because grappling with a new problem, or the new forms an old problem has taken is inherently exciting. The reassuring thing in this moment of high tension is that historically feminists have been extremely adept at addressing the problem of difference, not by solving it, but by working with it and by making it a critical tool of the theory that we practice. Thank you.
I'm going to try to be very brief. I'm going to throw out 2 questions for either of you, and you're welcome to answer them or ignore them if you want to say something else. I like the way you began with the Ottoman Empire, and one of the things that I've been thinking is, we often see the rise of the nation in the same way that we see the rise of secularism as a kind of teleological onward progress. But in fact, you could make the argument that the old empires did a lot better with religious difference. Not only the Ottoman, the Russian Empire, the Chinese Empire, even some of the modern European imperial empires. And so the question arises whether there's something about the nation state that creates, even though I don't like the word tolerance either, but you could talk about intolerance. And we think about, obviously, the fact that in both the United States and France, we have new immigrants who are very much internally the butts of these kinds of racist reactions, which did not seem to arise as much in the old empires. Mm-hmm. So that's one thought. The other one is about the following. We have a rise of what we might call fundamentalist movements that are very intolerant of others' religions. We have across many religions, not only the so-called Abrahamic religions, but in Hinduism as well, and many other places. And I obviously am slightly better informed about that version in the United States. You tie your argument about what's going on in the Islamic world, in Egypt, and in some of the various places you talked about, very much to the post-colonial situation and the whole legacy of imperialists really not only confirming, but in fact, in some cases, actually inventing so-called traditional religious law. And yet in the United States, which is not in a post-colonial situation anymore, I don't think you could say that for a couple of centuries, we have very, very similar things going on. Furthermore, in all of these, women are absolutely at the center. And we don't have a lot of comparative work about this, and we don't have any really fundamental explanations for this. We do have some psychoanalytic theory. We have some just sort of discourse theory about women representing the nation. But I wonder if you have ideas at a material level of what produces this tremendous focus on women as at the center of all the big moral questions. So, open to either of you.
I mean, it's a great question, that second one. I mean, Saba can answer the first, I think, better than I can.
Well, why don't you start with the second?
I guess we could say in some ways that women have often or always or for a long time been at the center of these disputes. But I think I tend to want to think this along with someone like the French sociologist Éric Fassin, who writes about a new age of sexual democracy, and that the sort of language of sexual democracy and sexual equality has become in the last years, he doesn't say exactly how many, a much more prevalent preoccupation, a sign somehow. I mean, it goes back certainly to the post-World War II era. One of the reasons I argue in some of my work that women get the vote in France is because women having the vote has become, by the 1940s, a sign of democracy, and that somehow or another to then give women the vote puts you in the league, in the French case, post-World War II, post the sort of collaboration with the Nazis and so on, puts you in the league with other political democracies. And so that somehow, and that more recently, sexual democracy has become a way of articulating what democracy means, almost as a substitute for the social equalities, social and economic equalities that one wants to talk about. I mean, in the case of France, the attention paid to the headscarf and now to burqas, a tiny minority of women wear them. The attention paid to that, to the Roma also, and to foreigners, to immigrants, to the treatment of women in these groups, has a lot to do with the displacement of attention away from the real economic, social, and political discrimination these groups face. So if you can argue that the French are somehow superior because their women are treated more equally, whatever that means, you then can put the blame for their own abjected status on the immigrant groups themselves. It's their own fault that they're this way. They're polygamous. There's one guy who's just published a book in France, a sociologist, whose name is now, I'm forgetting, it's something like Lagrange, who says something like, the reason for the riots in 2005, the uprisings in the banlieue, in the suburbs outside of Paris, which came in the wake of the killing of two young boys, or the death of two young boys who were being pursued by the police. The reason for that is that these kids all come from polygamous families, and the absence of a real father and the presence of too many mothers has produced this sort of thing. I mean, that's just one example of the sorts of logic that applies, but in some way, the elevation of the question of women and the emancipation of women, the sexual freedoms of women, has taken the place of discussions of social and economic discrimination. And that's not an ultimate explanation, but it's certainly how it's operating, I think, in those Western countries right now.
I can't say as to why women become the flashpoint for ageless controversies about power. There's a lot of interesting explanations, including your own work, that have attempted to give an answer to this. So I will bracket that question. I think it's almost an unanswerable question in some ways. I wanted to get back to what you were saying earlier about did actually empires, pre-modern empires, do better than nation states in terms of regulating relations across religious difference? I'm not entirely sure I would want to put it in that way, to say that the past was better than the present. I think it was distinctly different, and it was a different management of the problem of religious difference, as I tried to say, that at least under the Ottoman Empire, but I think you can see a similar pattern within the Mughal Empire, and that there was a different understanding of what difference was, and its regulation therefore was consistently different. You did not seek to eradicate difference, but you actually sought to preserve it and therefore manage it. I think the Christian history of 100 years of religious war within Christian denominations across Christian difference. I mean, remember that Europe was a relatively homogeneous place without the kind of diversity that you see, for example, in South Asia, or you see in the Ottoman Empire. The primary fissures were across Christian denominations, and so the settlement with the Peace of Westphalia in part addresses that problem, and we must remember that the Peace of Westphalia did not necessarily did not extend to all other religious heretics. It only addressed Calvinists, Catholics, and Lutherans, and it was much later that tolerance came to be extended. But I think what's interesting about that is that at the time of the birth of the notion of religious liberty within European history is also considered to be the birth of the nation state, and this is a pretty standard reading that is given of the Peace of Westphalia, even though the nation state is not born at that moment, but its sort of basic outlines are understood to emerge at that time. What's interesting is that the moment of the birth of the concept of religious liberty is also deeply tied to state sovereignty and the settlement of political conflicts across religious denominations, but across territories and warring parties. And that legacy actually teaches us something about the fact that religious liberty continues to be not simply an individual good, but it's a technique of governance in which religious difference is again problematized and managed in radically different ways. So the individualization of religious liberty, most famously in Locke's formulation, is in a sense actually what it makes possible is not just a privatization of belief. What it also separates is what it also enshrines is an individualist conception of liberty, which continues to haunt us. It's not the solution in many cases. In many ways, one can say it is the problem, and it's a different articulation of the problem of religious difference and its management by a centralized state. So I think there are different histories, though, at stake here, because I think what I was trying to track was how the Ottoman model of the millet system, it's very easy to narrate it. It's something that disappears. But in fact, aspects of it continue to inform and get embedded into the system of nation state and national polities. And it's not as if it's an old problem that somehow sits at odds with the modern problem, and therefore it's tradition holding back modernity or the true self-realization of a secular nation state. But it is to say that it's a different genealogy of the polity, and it's a different genealogy of management of secular difference.
Right there, start in.
Yes, thank you both for these really rich presentations. I think you both really usefully direct our attention to the ways in which secular liberalism as a political culture and governmentality produces both essentialized religious subjects and essentialized gender subjects, and then manages them in relationship to each other in a variety of ways. So I think it's a great intervention. My question is actually more specifically for you, Saba. What I find most fascinating about your paper is that you examine these tensions surrounding gender, religion, and the secular in Egypt from two very different perspectives. So on the one hand, the circumscription, the genealogy of the colonial and post-colonial circumscription of Sharia law as family, personal status law, family law, and its concomitant transformation into a modern legal apparatus. On the other hand, these sort of more recent geopolitical formations involving, among other groups, evangelical American Christians, and clearly these two come together, intersect in the case of, is it Wafa Constantine. I just wondered if you might want to say a little bit more about how you see them relating to each other more generally, that is to say the sort of specific legal history you're talking about, and then this more general contemporary geopolitical formation.
It's a great question. It's a difficult question. I would say that, I was drawn into this project by looking, through my fieldwork with contemporary debates about religious liberty in Egypt. And as I delved into it, I realized that how much of it was a historical problem, and that one had to unravel the historical dimension in order to understand the present. So part of the larger project, what it tries to do is to think of the birth of religious liberty and its introduction into the Middle East and into the Ottoman Empire as an exercise of European power. And in a sense, if historically I'm trying to think of how religious liberty is very much conditioned by a whole set of global geopolitical changes. It's not just simply that, for example, colonial rule simply introduces and that it becomes indigenized, which is the most common way of thinking about it. In fact, what happens with much of the Ottoman territories in the Middle East is that religious liberty is actually introduced through first through Christian power and then eventually through various forms of secular treaties and international laws and so on. And so in the Wafa Constantine story, and particularly the role that evangelical Christians have come to play in it, I see a parallel tract of trying to think of what is the geopolitical force in the present and how that is really transforming both the self-understanding of Copts as a minority, as a besieged minority, as a discriminated minority. And yet that this new moment of an American evangelical Christianity that can set aside doctrinal differences that were very crucial to the articulation of Western Christendom against Eastern Christendom, of which Coptic Christianity was a part, they're really setting that aside at this point, and a new entente has emerged between Western and Eastern Christianity as a result of American evangelicals. So I'm interested in what that geopolitical force is and how that's then changing and transforming the concept and practice of religious liberties. In a sense, I see the question of geopolitical linkage that cuts across the Western and non-Western divide as sort of parallel but predicated in many different sets of interventions.
Yeah, back there in that corner.
I have a question specifically for Professor Scott. You started your presentation by evoking Wendy Brown's book,
Regulating Aversion.
Yeah, and I was thinking about the subtitle also, which is Tolerance in the Age of Identity and Empire, and it relates to the question about empire here. But specifically, and I was also thinking about the word democracy, which finally appeared in your response to Professor Gordon's question in relation to empire also. So in Regulating Aversion, Brown is kind of arguing against tolerance as a mode of governmentality, and kind of seeks to get beyond all the tolerance talk to get to some kind of notion of democracy, or to ask the question how democracy can be thought beyond tolerance talk. So this question is particularly relevant here, I would say, because Abu Dhabi is the mode of governmentality. There's, of course, tolerance instead of democracy. There's no democracy, there's tolerance. And while Abu Dhabi has a free speech zone in which our free speech is being tolerated, but of course there's no democracy. The vast majority of the people who live there are not actually citizens. So,
be a little quicker so we can have
yes,
more.
okay, so democracy, specifically what you said about difference and managing difference and how you can demarcate that from, say, people like John Gray or something who want to manage conflict, have models of tolerance of like managing conflict, how you would kind of pose a more, or think about a more democratic alternative to those kinds of models of empire and managing conflict.
Well, it's a huge question, and I don't know anything about Abu Dhabi. You guys are the ones who know about how it works, and I really know almost nothing about the way in which government and governmentality work there. But I guess the question is, the question I think Wendy Brown asks about democracy are how would you deal with difference, not as a question of hierarchies of tolerance or hierarchies in which there are dominant groups and minority groups, or if there are dominant groups and minority groups, how you could understand difference as a mode of being rather than everybody's mode of being, rather than assume that the dominant group is tolerating the various other minority groups. And you would think that, I would imagine, the way I think it or try to think it is in line with philosophers like Jean-Luc Nancy in France, who write about community and the notion that rather than thinking of ourselves as having a common being, that is, that there's some way in which we all have to be the same or similar or assimilated to a set of dominant norms or behaviors, that we think about ourselves as having being in common. And what he takes being to be is the notion that all of us, individuals, groups, are constructed through difference and through, we are not ever autonomous whole individuals, but our difference depends on the recognition and relationship with others. So that difference is the core of being. And if you start with that premise, what does that do then to the possibility of thinking social and political arrangements in a more democratic way? That's how I start, at least, the conversation that you're trying to provoke, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about how in each of your talks, you both sort of read the birth of secularism and this establishment as privatization. And I was just wondering how that genealogy comes up in your work, because you mentioned that, and I'm sort of reading it against my own expertise, which is in the history of religion in the U.S. Of course, this establishment in the U.S. didn't privatize religion, but rather created this sort of voluntary sector that actually invited women to participate actively in benevolent societies and temperance movements and so forth, at least within the context of America. So it wasn't a move towards privatization, even though it was a separation of religion from the state. Now, of course, this idea of voluntary sort of encapsulates this notion of individual choice, and it certainly this notions of gender that circumscribed women as sort of the bearers of religious virtue and so forth. So this wasn't a neat type of freedom, but I wondered, about this reading of sort of disestablishment as privatization and where that comes out of.
I mean, I think it's the literature that I think both Joan and I are assuming is the literature produced under this new field of secular studies, which has been consistently argued across American, European, non-Western, Middle Eastern, South Asian contexts, is to say that one of the ways in which this self-understanding of secularism as a separation of church and state needs to be complicated is that in fact church and state are not necessarily separate, but the state comes to regulate increasingly what religious life is and assigns it a particular place in society, and that requires ultimately constant intervention in forms of religious life in order to set it in its proper context. The privatization of religion is actually a thesis that is parallel to, that is developed at the same time as this insight into secularism is developed, which is to argue that religion comes to be privatized doesn't mean that it does not have a public space. That's not what it means. It can have, in fact, in the American context, many of the American historians have argued that, in fact, it is the the fact that it's individualized and privatized is precisely the condition for its articulation in American evangelical tradition, because American evangelical tradition, in fact, is very much premised on an individualist conception of religion, and therefore the idea of witnessing and so on and so forth is very much predicated. And so religion, in fact, comes to be, since Tocqueville, we have noted that in America, the ascendance of religion in public culture and civil life, or Robert Bella's work, is paramount. But what's interesting is that the privatization of religious belief is not that it's not present in public life, but it comes to be understood as a private experience that each individual gives assent to.
And it's a matter of private individual conscience.
Right.
Rather than
Set of clerical traditions or clerical authority.
I just want to say one thing about this, that in some ways the idea that church and state are separate is a little analogous to the idea that the market is separate from the state. And both of these things are, of course, constructed. The rules under which they operate are constructed by the state. But that gives rise to, and I think this is what both Joan and Saba are talking about, a very particular idea of freedom and free choice, which is highly, highly ideological, and particularly strong in this country because it imagines that there is such a thing as entirely free individual choice in religion as well as in other things without constraints.
So I think the privatization of religion formula, if one can recite it, it is a recitable formula that religion comes to be understood as a system of beliefs to which an individual gives assent. Right. So becomes a matter of conscience, and so it could be very public, but its touchstone, its ability to establish its truth emanates from the private conscience.
I just wanted to say that there's some sort of big themes that are sort of out there that aren't in view, but they keep popping up in some way. And one of them that I wanted to mention. One is the role of Christianity in Western imperialism. I think is really an important feature. Missionaries, Christian ideology in imperial regimes. I think the idea that the British Empire was this great holding camp for diversity is totally wrong. It was a very, very strongly religiously embodied, or driven kind of operation in many ways. I could give a million examples. Don't need to elaborate them. But the main thing is they're all Christian, and they become increasingly evangelical. And the Americans are a good example of this also. So that's one thing I think that's relevant, is that the political space of the global West is not a secular space in many ways. That's one thing. The other part of it, which is quite relevant, is that Islam has a long tradition of anti-imperialist activity, which the British Empire recognized right from the very beginning. 1871 is a great year with this W.W. Hunter's work on rebels against the Raj, basically attributing it all to Islamic terrorists and opposition groups that are rising from, believe it or not, Afghanistan, where the British are fighting quite dramatically. And so there's as a religious phenomenon, there's a very strong association of Islam with anti-imperialist activity. And certainly in South Asia this has been true, and I think in other parts of the world it's true also. And I think today it could well said to be true also. So I think that there's a little, there's an extent to which the politics of religion perhaps needs to be cycled back into the whole problem of what it means to tolerate another religion when, or these minority religions within the framework of the global political economy. I think that's all.
Let's take a couple more questions or comments and then give our speakers a final word here. Yeah, please.
I have two questions. Thanks a lot. So first, I think it would be for Saba, and then maybe the next one. One question I've been thinking is that, like, the kind of preoccupation, almost obsession we see with I think broadly maybe more than we see now in the context that you discussed, in like Middle East or Africa, in post-colonial context. More than that, we see in Christianity, and now particularly evangelical Christianity, is like the obsession with sex, and not just talking about women, but like sex in the sense of like the abortion, homosexuality, like this, the way that we even I come from Iran, and we haven't even seen it to that extent ever, like that kind of focus on the sex as the, in fact, they will, and all that so much of evangelical activism is around. So I was just thinking, so this is a very different context, like the US evangelical movement, which doesn't have that history that you discussed, and doesn't have that formation, maybe at least differently from the how family laws were made out. So I just want to see your reflection on how do you understand? Is there a similarity or not? Is there just different phenomena happening? One was this. My other question was that. It's maybe a little bit going off the talk, but it's also you're a European historian. So how we now tend to understand, let's say, what happened in to Jewish people in Europe in the 50s is very much, at least the lay understanding is very much within paradigms of racism and nationalism, rather than thinking in terms of religion. But it seems that right now what is happening, which has quite some similarities in terms of like the U.S. war is happening, like for a decade now, and then what's happening as we had Palestine, and then we see parallelly in the Europe, like gypsies are being pushed out, but it seems that right now we are much more understanding what is happening in terms of religion and secularism rather than nationalism and racism. So sorry, I just wanted to see what is the difference in that.
Let's see if there are any other questions. Yeah.
My question is to Saba Mahmood. When we talk about public-private division and the indeterminacy state produces, I wonder whether how this indeterminacy is used by state as a discussion, as a debate with religious authority and state authorities. Because when we say state sovereignty, I think it's a bit obscure now, at least for me. And I want you to elaborate on this. And secondly, are we not forgetting a bit about capitalism, that how secularism and capitalism cooperate? Actually, and my question is now for both speakers, that shouldn't we bring political economical analysis in the scene? Because secularism by its workings also creates a class that's why we don't have a Muslim academia, Muslim elite in some sense in the Middle East.
Okay, please.
I had a follow-up to your question, Professor Gordon. What do you think about how the freedom of movement that we now have in the modern world and the fact that you can communicate so quickly over such wide spaces has with respect to tolerance now versus when there were empires and it took days to travel or get word across?
Okay, go to it.
Well, I'll do I think your comment is a comment, has to be taken as a comment rather than as a question. I mean, it's a very useful reminder of those histories. As far as the question of racism and nationalism, I think that's what's going on now. I mean, I think the Muslim question is the old Jewish question. And you can, it's even clearer as the anti-immigrant, the question becomes anti-immigrants. So the Roma, immigrants of whatever kind, but mostly what is meant are Muslim immigrants, because that is the phenomenon that's being addressed. And the geopolitical context of the world in which we are supposedly in a clash of civilizations, in which the new Cold War is a war of against terrorism, and Islam figures, whether as the real or imaginary enemy, as the enemy. So the terms have been switched to religious terms, but the issues of racism and nationalism, it seems to me, continue. And in fact, Wendy Brown, just to cite her yet again, has a new book which is called Walls, in which she looks at the phenomenon of the wall in Israel, the wall on the American-Mexican border, and so on and so forth. And she talks about the fact that we're living in an age in which sovereignty is in fact declining, but these walls represent an attempt to assert yet again a kind of almost theological presence of the power of the nation state. They don't succeed, they don't manage to do it, but they're doing it. And I think the campaigns against immigrants of all kinds are another form of the attempt to secure the powers and the image and the boundaries of the nation state in the face of its decline. So in a way, in opposition to those earlier forms of racism and nationalism, in which racism enables the consolidation and enhances the power of nation states. Now you're in a situation in which that old power is attempted to be protected by these same means, which are the sort of racist, the identification of the other, and the sort of racist campaigns against them. That they're in religious guise now happens to be because of the way in which the others have been portrayed, the dangerous others have been portrayed.
Sorry, can I? Yeah. Because then when we discuss the question of, let's say, war and France, where we do engage, like let's say, like in the conversation, we do engage with questions of secularism. We're not like just saying that that's like a guise for like racism. Like, so I just wanted to see.
Well, it's become, but laïcité has become a way of a code word for saying we don't tolerate these others, and they are these dangerous others, and so on and so forth.
And I think the point that you were making earlier is crucial here, that it's sexual democracy, which is not a descriptive term, it's an ideological term, obviously, becomes the measure for actually then deciding who is or is not properly to be included within the paradigm of laïcité. Right, I mean, and this is partly what the alliance, there is an interesting article by Judith Butler on this topic, talking about Europe and precisely the alliance between what were historically very homophobic communities who have now cast their lot with the Islamophobes in a quest for establishing actually supposedly a tolerance for sexual diversity, right? So, and that's not just an opportunistic alliance. I think there's something about this claim to sexual democracy that enables that kind of, for example, this test given to the immigrants in the Netherlands, where only immigrants from certain parts of the world, not the European world, were asked to see this video of gay men kissing each other before they would be allowed to actually become citizens. And of course, the assumption there is that only certain parts of the world are homophobic, as if homophobia has not been part of the European culture at large. This test was, of course, eventually discarded, and so. But I think there is the incitation to defining secularism as a culture of sexual diversity and sexual democracy then actually invites and incites the kind of enunciations that you get from somebody like Ahmadinejad, who says there are no homosexuals in Iran, right? I mean, but these are kind of mirror images of each other, rather than Europe being the place of sexual democracy and Iran being the place of non-sexual democracy. We've got to actually see how the closures enacted on both sides produce each other. And I don't think that the question of sex and sexuality is cast in every in all parts of the Muslim world equally. I think Iran is an interesting example. And I think if you look at the history of Egypt, for example, there were certain moments when that emerges, but actually it becomes, the Queen Boat controversy is a very memorable incident where issues of homosexuality really came to the fore as a means of thinking about what is the issue with public order and public moral order. But then it abates, and then again it's the fear of HIV and AIDS epidemic that it emerges again. But the idea that it's actually sexuality that is the defining yardstick for instituting secularism is not a very prevalent trope in most of the Middle East.
I want to thank you all for coming, and particularly to thank Professors Scott and Mahmood for these just very deep presentations.
Thank you all.